last video footage that we had, and that video footage, again, for your own resource and your own reference purposes, is off a documentary called The Untold Story of the Arab Slave Trade. The Untold Story of the Arab Slave Trade. And you can find that on YouTube. And it'll give you a further expanded, history and definition about this particular subject matter. The material that you are getting ready to see now is a particular book, excuse me, that was written by John Azuma, a Ghanaian from Ghana, who wrote the book called The Legacy of the Arab Islam in Africa. And he deals with, again, somewhat the same subject matter, but from a more contemporary context, because the material that you just listened to previously were dealing in historical material that goes all the way back to the 6th and 7th century, versus the material that you are going to deal with now is written from a contemporary point of view, but gives you insight into some of the same material. So we will go and commence.
The legacy of Arab Islam in Africa. Thanks for speaking with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Can you please just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you come from and what work you do?
Yeah, I'm originally from Ghana, in West Africa. And presently I teach at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur as the Associate Professor for World Christianity and Islam.
Now, why did you write this book?
Well, first of all, I wrote the book. It's a publication of my doctoral thesis, which I did in the University of Birmingham, UK. And I wrote the book because there was very little writing on some of the themes that I wanted to address, that I addressed in the book, having to do with the theme of Islam's interaction with African traditional religions, the whole history of jihad in West Africa, and as part of that, a very important part of that, the slave raiding and the slave trade that happened within West Africa by Muslim communities. That was why I wrote the book, because not many had written on these kind of themes in Islam history in West Africa.
Now, I'd like to look at one of the topics in your book, the topic of colonization. We know that the Christian West colonized Africa. The West has acknowledged this and is self-critical in this regard. Did the Islamic empires colonize Africa?
Well, yes, there was a lot of activities on the part of Muslims in Africa, especially in West Africa. What happened there was not necessarily outside colonization, but there was a form of colonization in the sense that the dominant Islamic tribes conquered weaker tribes and imposed Islamic rule over them. Mm-hmm. And therefore there was some kind of internal colonization going on. The Fulani in West Africa in particular were very much in the habit of conquering and imposing Islamic rule on other tribes. So that was a form of internal colonization, yes.
What about with the Arab conquest of North Africa? Was that a form of colonization?
Absolutely. That the Arab conquest of North Africa was a form of colonization that took place in the 7th century when Arab Muslims burst out of Saudi Arabia and conquered Egypt and went on to conquer the whole of North Africa. There were a lot of Berber tribes there. The Egyptian Copts were the original indigenous of the land, as well as the Berbers. And they were all conquered and Islamized and Arabized. Mm-hmm. That was also a form of colonization, definitely.
Now, do Muslims today acknowledge this? Are they self-critical about this?
Not to the extent that the West has become very critical. In fact, many Muslims don't even admit that there was any form of colonization. Even though if you talk to the Berbers, and let's be also aware that many of the Berbers have become Muslim, The Berbers will tell you they have been colonized. There's been Arab imperialism. The same thing in Egypt. The Copts know that they are the original, the indigenes of the place. They feel like they have been colonized. The same thing will happen we talk to Sudanese. They will tell you that Sudan was colonized by Arab Muslim invaders. So yes, they will not admit it, but there is that kind of history there.
Okay, thanks for that. I want to move on to the topic of slavery now. Did the Muslim empires practice slavery?
Absolutely. Slavery was a very important part of Islamic expansion in West Africa. In fact, in the Sudan and from the very earliest period of Islamic penetration into Africa, it started by buying, purchasing slaves and trading in slaves, and then it went on from purchasing to raiding for slaves and capturing slaves deliberately, especially mainly black Africans, and transporting them into North Africa and into Saudi Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, and onwards to the Ottoman Empire to Turkey. So slavery was a very endemic part of Islamic interaction with Africa. And in West Africa, the jihad's period of the 18th and 19th century involved massive slave raiding and slave trading. And many of the slaves that were captured and sent and sold and taken into the transatlantic slave trade, most of those who were doing the raiding at the time were Muslim communities because they were the dominant tribes. So a lot of that happened. That is not to say that non-Muslim communities were involved in raiding, but the dominant tribes were the Muslim communities that were doing the raiding at the time.
The treatment of slaves is a topic that you bring up in your book. Can you talk about some of the differences in the way that slaves were treated in the Western world compared to in the Islamic world?
Yeah, one of the themes I explored in my book is this perception that Muslims treated their slaves much more humanely than the Western slave trade. And what I found out in my own research was that that is not necessarily the case, and that there were very harsh treatments of slaves by Muslim groups. It was just a done deal at the time. And one of the key differences I looked at in my book whereas slaves taken to the West were able to marry and reproduce and have their families, and you can still find large populations of African Americans today in North America and in the Caribbean. You go to the Islamic world and you find very few black remnants of the slave trade, which was very massive. And one of the reasons is that many of the male black slaves taken into the Islamic world were castrated as eunuchs, which meant that they could not, of course, reproduce. And the other factor is that many of the women were taken as concubines by their slave masters, and they gave birth to mixed races, and they were very much absorbed into the society. So you don't have
absorbed
black,
into the Arab society.
Slave kind of descendants in the Muslim world as you would in North America. And part of the reason is the castration and the way the slaves were treated.
Did the Islamic world abolish slavery?
Slavery persisted in Islamic countries far, far longer than it did in the West. Western governments and from all kinds of activist groups. And in fact, the Saudi Arabia, for instance, abolished slavery in 1961 or 1960 thereabout, whereas Mauritania abolished slavery in 1981. And these were done on paper, and a lot of it is still being done. In practice, there are still a lot of slaves in Muslim countries. And the Sudan, during the Civil War, there was a lot of slave raiding going on, done by the Arab Muslims in the north against the enemies and the Christian Africans in the south. So even up to the 90s and this century, there was still capturing of young African men, boys in the Sudan for sale. So slavery continues, even though it has been abolished on paper in many Muslim countries.
I often hear Muslims talking about the golden age of Islam, and they look back to this as the time when Islam ruled, and this is the golden period that they look back to. What's your understanding of the golden period, the golden age of Islam?
Yeah, it depends on which Muslims group we are talking about, but the golden age of Islam, many Muslims look back to the period between the 7th and the 9th century.
No, 9th and
during the
13th.
Abbasid Caliphate, or rather from the 9th century to around the 13th century, during
Right.
the Abbasid Caliphate.
That's right.
They talk about it as the golden period of Islam. But if you look at that history, it is fraught with difficulties, with a lot of problems. Yes, a lot of progress was made under that period. There were times of very stable rulership. There were times of and exploration. There was a lot of that going on, but that does not necessarily, and that was the time that Islamic orthodoxy was formalized. So there were a lot of milestones within that period. But in terms of golden period, I think it's very tricky to begin to talk about golden periods. If we look back and look at how messy the whole situation was at that period and many other periods in Islamic history, just like many of the other empires.
Yeah, because from what you were saying, it was a time of conquests, colonization, and slavery as well.
Absolutely.
With everything else.
Absolutely.
So there may have been those great moments, but there's still conquest, colonization, and slavery as part of it.
Absolutely. And during that time, it has to be said, Muslims were not the only ones who were conquering, other people were conquering also.
That's right.
And slavery, yes, during the 9th up to the 13th century, slavery was still very much an Islamic phenomenon as compared to the West. Of course, there was ancient slavery in many other societies, but in terms of chattel slavery, in terms of slavery as an institution, that was profitable. That was very much still an Arab Islamic preserve until the West came in sometime from the 15th, 16th century onwards. So yes, there was a lot of that as part of that so-called golden period of Islam.
Now, discussing these ideas in our universities is not always an easy thing to do. In your book, you write, hence, in the study of Islam in the West, the dominant convention is that a critical approach is reserved for the Christian past, but forbidden for the Muslim past. The net result is a romantic picture of the history of Islam, avoiding and sometimes denying such issues as the jihadist slaughter and mass enslavement of traditional African believers. Can you just talk to us a bit about your experience as an African in the Western universities talking about these issues?
Yeah, that is actually a very important question. I, as an African who embarked on the study of Islam in Africa, was very frustrated that, especially back in the 90s when I was doing my studies, that Western academics were shying away, almost self-censoring on these difficult themes of jihad, of the violence associated with jihad, and the slave raiding and slave trade that was very massively undertaken by Muslim societies in Africa. And some only noted in a footnote, and we don't want to discuss it. And that was very frustrating. Meanwhile, they will go at length and talk freely and openly about the Western transatlantic dimension of slave trade. And so for me, this painting of a very romantic picture of the Islamic past in Africa was hindering interfaith dialogue and dialogue between Muslims and Christians in particular. And especially in a situation where the radical Muslim groups were laying claim to these histories, these romanticized histories that was written mainly by Western scholars, that they had a golden age of Islam in Africa that they want to return to. Unfortunately, many of the groups that we have today that are ideological Muslim radical groups and even Boko Haram in Nigeria are laying claim to some of these romanticized histories that has been contributed to by Western scholarship and academia on the west of Islam in Africa. And that's what I was trying to challenge and to raise questions about, that we have to paint a more realistic history of the past. Africans have to get a more holistic history of their past. If we have to live together, have meaningful dialogue between ourselves as Muslims and Christians.
So what do you think is the way forward?
Yeah, as I explored in my book, the reason why I wrote this book was not to be polemical against Islam or anything of that sort. It was simply to say to African Muslims, my co-Africans, fellow Africans, that look, both on the Islamic and Christian fronts and on the past, we have difficult histories with the way these traditions interact with Africa. So we need to take both histories critically. We need to study the histories critically, instead of denying and romanticizing one history. Because when we do that, we are not going to, unless we understand our past very clearly and honestly, we cannot move forward with any sense of integrity and mutual respect.
That's right.
So the whole idea is, how do we move forward? Let's have a much more critical discourse of our past.
That's right.
And then we can move forward with meaningful futures together. That's the only way to move forward in this.
Thank you very much for talking with us today.
Thank you.
Very, very, very powerful.
Let me ask you again, his book and his name.
His name is
The Legacy
John. His name is John Azuma. The book is The Legacy of the Arab.
Today I'm speaking with Dr. John Azuma, the author.
The name of the book is The Legacy of the Arab Islam in Africa.
Now, do you have the book in your possession?
No, not at the moment. As a matter of fact, I was just introduced to it day before yesterday.
All right.
That's how I found the information.
Now, I know you're going to order it, huh?
That's without a doubt.
I will pay you. Can you order 2 copies?
Okay, that's not a problem.
Just,
That's without a doubt. But it just shows you how much, Mr. Brown, how much information is available, on the subject matter, how there are individuals who are literally using the right approach in trying to discuss, much less critically analyze and critique the material. And then second, that they are courageous enough to disseminate the material in particular, outlets that might not be receptive to the material. And it just shows you that this is the kind of research that, we should be attracted to, because we know that he did an honest approach. Here's a guy who wrote this as his thesis, master's degree, material. And he did it. PhD, right. And that in this process that he used it as a major stepping stone. So this is like his magnum opus. It's the major, writing that he debuts the world with, coming out of, educational experience and giving them some insight in regard to this particular issue. So those of you make yourself available to John Azuma, the legacy of the Arab Islam in Africa. And then second, the other material is the untold story of Arab slave trade, you can find on the YouTube documentary. So both of those you want to avail yourself to and do some more in-depth, research in those areas. And I'm pretty sure that it will be rewarding. But one of the things that you have to take into consideration anytime you're doing research on the net, and that is that you have to filter the material, because it's a lot of gobbledygook. It's a whole lot of material that is of insignificant value, and you don't want to get caught up in that web of nonsense. And so be very selective in the sites that you choose, and look at the material that is based on, at least some scientific acclaim, that you can look at background material or papers or interviews that these particular people have done, and that you can get a better insight and understanding of not just the subject matter but the personality, you see. So we'll go a little further, and what I'll do now is, based on those two particular visual accounts, I'll start to lay out some book material that you can use as source material, and we'll talk about it briefly. Each book we'll talk about briefly. Now you can see the role that Islam and all of that played in regard to the development of Islam, of the slave trade from an Arab perspective. And as the gentleman indicated, that whether it was John Azuma or the brother from the Untold Story, both of them indicated one 13 centuries and the other one 14 centuries. That's pretty much a very different time.
One 13 centuries or 4 centuries?
No, one was 13 centuries. In other words, the first guy in the Untold Story, who just gave you most, audio material, he used 13 centuries. He said that it was 13 centuries of Arab or Islamic slavery. And Dr. Azuma said 14 centuries. So again, 13 or 14, give or take 100, it don't make that much different. But we know one thing, that the amount of time was extraordinarily different between the European slave trade of 419 years. And we get that basically based on that particular point of view. And that was based on Europe, deciding eventually to get into the trade. And they didn't get into the trade because it was some escapade of their venture, some, travel venture to go around the world and see what they could get. No, it was because of necessity. And I resort back to that claim again Dr. Jeffries gave to us, and that was resource poor, land poor, and people poor. And because Portugal, Spain, and England was the farther west of the Asian peninsula, that means that they was at the farthest, you could go as the landmass went, that all of the products that they sought out for, spices and, metallurgy products and different type of textiles and, even on the Silk Road and all of that, they knew that in order to acquire those particular products, that they would have to go through many, many countries and tariff prices, that they would have to pay large amounts in order to get a product in. And by the time it got all the way, say, from India or China, all the way to Spain, Portugal, or England, the price was so high the average person couldn't buy it anyway. It was out of their reach. And it was only left for the elite to have access to certain kind of products. So this caused a problem, and this is what literally became the necessity or the driving force of Portugal as well as Spain to use a marina route in order to remedy the problem of going across all of that particular land. The book that Professor Simmons used for that information was this book here. And when he first introduced it to us, I was like, what the hell is this? It's called Imperialism and World Politics by Parker T. Moon. And when he first introduced me to this book, I was like, Professor, what that got to do with African history? So he was like, you'll see. This book was originally written in 1927, Parker T. Moon, or Parker Thomas Moon, Imperialism and World Politics. And it deals in the conquest and the development of the economic infrastructure of European world power on a global basis. In other words, not just being regulated or, bounded by the little European enclave, but eventually, expanding out to different, markets around the world and exploiting them to the hilt. And Parker T. Moon was an economist, and he dealt with how they went to these particular places and subdue these people and acquire all the necessary resources that they needed to survive. So that became one of the issues. And out of that, we studied a variety of information.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, sir.
Because we're talking about the Arabs, we're talking about Islam, but Islam, at least Isabella, I could be wrong because I'm just trying. Isabella and Fernando conspired with Islam in the bringing down of the empire of Sangay, which was the last
major West African,
empire. Can you talk about that?
Well, mainly the issue you got to remember, taking into consideration, we're actually talking about literally the end of the 15th century. And what is taking place at that time is the Europeans now are literally starting to feel their strength as a group, much less as entities, whether it be Rome or Germany or England or any of these particular areas. They're now, beginning to, feel their strength. And this is the opposite for those individuals who happen to be Muslims or happen to be of the Islamic persuasion. They are now weak. You have this situation where that in Spain, the Moors came in at a 7-11. Now we're talking 1492. This is 800 years later. They are now weary and weak. And now the influence of their contribution has been felt throughout Europe. And the Europeans have benefited from this, whether it be educational, whether it be from a medical point of view, whether it be from intellectualism. They have just benefited so wholeheartedly based on the influence and the contact of the Moors and Islam into Europe as early as the latter part of the 7th century, the latter decade of the 7th century. And that in itself changed the whole makeup. And you got to remember is that when we talk about Ghana, Mali, and Sangay, this is a book that I use. It's a very, very good book. It's written by a family, the McKissack family. That's Patricia and Frederick. Very, very good writers. They usually write young adult and children books, but they also write, on material pertaining to the African American experience. And this is a very easy to read book, and it gives a great deal of what I would call some detailed material. And if we talk about the issue of Mali, Sangay, and Ghana, we have to take into consideration the areas from which they come. So I want to show you this. As you can see, this is the map. This is West Africa. As you can see, these are modern day nation states that you see, where you see the border lines. But where you see the diagonal lines, the dots, and the dotted lines, those are the lines to indicate the ancient civilizations of Ghana, Mali, and Sangay. So as you can see, the dotted ones that you see right here in this area, where you see all these little dots, that is the area that literally contained the state of Ghana. And as you can see, it's in between the Senegal River and the Niger River, actually at their joining points. And as you can see, just a little bit bigger than that, you'll see Mali. And that's what the lines you see here. And it goes around, directly around the area that we called Ghana. And then if you see further than that, this is the Sangay. And as you can see, Sangay is around Mali and Ghana put together. It was much larger.
Yes.
And what you also see in here is the time periods. Is Ghana is the earliest of the three civilizations, and Songhai is the last. So that's why you have this strong influence of Islam, you know, and then the whole issue of the incoming new guys on the blocks, which is the Europeans, you know, which are eventually going to take over a particular aspect of the trade. But one of the things that the gentleman said in one of the documentaries was that one of the reasons that we don't see remnants of the Arab slave is because of castration. In other words, they castrated an individual. They didn't have, you know, the opportunity to create offsprings. And what they did was all of the women that were confiscated as concubines inside the Arab trade became part of the Arab family. That means they were absorbed, and they were, like you said, them mixed individuals who eventually become Arabs. And because they are darker, they identify more as Arab than they identify as what? African. Here's a good example of that. This is a gentleman, these two gentlemen should be actually put together. These two gentlemen. They should be put together. One on the right hand side, or on my left hand side, is Tibu Tib, as you can see him here. And it says the East African slave trade. And then on the right side, it says King Leopold's Ghost. This is written by Adam Hochschild, and this deals with the slavery and the bondagement of the King Leopold, what is called the Congo Free State. And the reason that these guys should be joined at the hip was because they both kill a lot of Africans. So what I want to do is I want to share with you some of the reason why this individual should be looked at with the most terror and disdain, the most contempt and corrupt that you could imagine. And you can see he was purely an African, and purely an African of visible, you know, that's right. And in the book, it shows you Tibu Tip's family tree, his whole family tree, and you'll find out that in his family tree, his father and his grandfather were also slave traders. So, you know, they were part of that whole scenario. So I want to read to you a little bit about Tibu Tib and why he looked at himself in a certain way, and he approached and literally embraced Arabism at the behest of Africanism. Get my glasses. Again, this is from the text is called Tibu Tib and the East African Slave Trade. It's by Leda, L-E-D-A, Leda Farrant, F-A-R-R-A-N-T, Farrant, Leda Farrant. The book was originally published by the St. Martin's Press, and it was originally published in 1975. I'm going to give you a little bit on Dust Jacket, and then we'll go into something about Tibu Tib. It says Hamid bin Muhammad, better known as Tibu Tib, was one of the last great slavers of the 19th century. His rule extended for thousands of miles, west and north, west of Lake Tanganyika, and his name was known and feared in most of East and Central Africa. Great explorers such as Livingstone, Cameron, Stanley, and Wiseman knew him well and made extensive use of his power over the African tribes and his intimate knowledge of the regions they explored. King Leopold of the Belgians appointed him governor of the Congo Free State, and the Sultan of Zanzibar wanted to appoint him Wali, or governor of Tabora, the important stronghold for Zanzibar Arabs in central Tanzania. Today, Tibu Tib cannot be regarded as a hero since his exploits and gains were at the expense of other human beings. He must, however, be regarded as a brave and daring adventurer, a good administrator, and a great leader of men. He also opened up unknown parts of Africa and helped the explorers who described them to the world. When he died, a small item in the London Times announced the death of one of the greatest slavers. Let me say that again. The London Times announced his death as one of the greatest slavers, but not a word about the part he played in the discovery of the African interior, the help and protection he gave explorers and missionaries, and the fact that in doing so, he brought about the end of slavery, Arab domination, and his own destruction in the very countries which he conquered and held for almost 30 years. Leda Ferrant, who lives in Kenya and has spent much time in Zanzibar, where Tibu Tib was born and bred, has studied everything written on the subject. From Heinrich Brode's biography, 1903 onward, and has had access to the Mojabi family. Mojabi, those are people from Timbuktu in that area. It says that, and has also access to the Mojabi family's papers for the first time. She has written a vivid and absorbing life of one of the most colorful characters of his time. Leda Ferrant was born in Rome of Italian parents and has lived in Ethiopia and Tanzania before taking up residence in Nairobi. She is married and has 2 sons, a white lady that live in Kenya. And I bet you $1,000 she married to a black guy. Betcha.
Why do you say that?
Because you don't go to Africa, hang out, see all that big long stuff and don't want to take a part of it. Because you know ain't nothing in Europe like that. I'm just telling you what Dr. Ben told me.
Okay.
I know Dr. Ben would be very, very satisfied. But let me go a little bit more about Tibu Tib. It says, Hamed bin Mohammed bin Juma bin Rajad el Mojabi, better known as Tibu Tib, was one of the last great slavers of the 19th century. Now it's funny that they say great slavers. It's like saying great Hitler.
Yeah.
Right. But you notice ain't nobody making stuff about that. But if Farrakhan said Hitler was wickedly great, he'd be all over the newspapers tonight. Right. But anyway, let me go on. It says that his rule extended for thousands of miles west and northwest of Lake Tanganyika, and his name was known and feared in most of the East and Central Africa. Great explorers such as Livingstone, Cameron, Stanley, and Wiseman knew him well and made extensive use of his power over the African tribes. And his intimate knowledge of the regions they explored, Leopold, King of the Belgians, appointed him governor of the Congo Free State, and the Sultan of Zanzibar wanted him to appoint him Wali, or governor of Tabora, the important stronghold for Zanzibar Arabs in central Tanzania. It says after regarding him for a few minutes, I came to the conclusion that the Arab was a remarkable man, the most remarkable man I had met among Arabs, wa Swahili, and half caste of Africa. He was neat in his person. His clothes were of a spotless white. His fez cap brand new. His waist was encircled by a rich dowel. His dagger was splendid. His silver filigree and his tout ensemble was that of an Arab gentleman in very comfortable circumstances. They're talking about a description of Tibu Tib, and they're describing him predominantly as an Arab. It says Stanley was anxious to enlist Tibu Tib's help in his search for the Congo River, but frightening stories about one of Tibu Tib's followers. But let me go on. I want to get into this area about
enslavement.
No, about how he seen himself. Let me see. It says that Tibu Tib, this was too much. Stanley, he snatched. His vanity would have been flattered by Stanley's description. He's talking about Morton Stanley, you know, the explorer, right? He says his vanity would have been flattered by Stanley's description of their first meeting, but for one detail, the mention of his negroid the mention of his negroid complexion. Tibu Tib was very touchy on this subject. He considered himself a pure Arab, and the fact that nobody should notice that his complexion and features betrayed one African blood annoyed him intensely. In fact, he inherited his negroid features from an African great-great-grandmother. Ahmed bin Muhammad, later nicknamed Tibu Tib, was therefore almost justified in considering himself a full-blooded Arab gentleman, despite his Negro features. He certainly behaved like an Arab, but he was perhaps a little more insistent in demanding respect from all who met him than the average Arab trader. His narrative is frequently peppered with the words, "They treat me with great respect," and one soon gets the impression that the powerful man suffered from at least one inferiority complex, which perhaps explains his wish to be recognized as the benefactor of all of the explorers who passed through his territories. In those days, an Arab would consider it a great slight to be mistaken for an African. In other words, they didn't like that shit. If you was an Arab and somebody said, "Oh, you look like African to me," they'd be like, "What the hell wrong with you? You stupid or something? I'm Arab." And Africans who wanted to be Arab, that's how they treated themselves. So if you looked at them and they was black as midnight and you called them an African, they would say like, "Shit, my father is from Muhammad's family line," you know, and then go into that and like beat you down. Ahmed bin Muhammad was also very conscious of the nervous twitching of his eye, and although he was known as the one who blinks, or Tibu Tib, he didn't like the interpretation of his nickname. As he told the German professor Henrik Brode in 1903, when the latter recorded Tibu Tib's life in Swahili and then published it in German, the name Tibu Tib had been given me by the locals who had fled to Urungu. They said they had seen many Wangwana, which is some group of a tribal group, and had seized their goods, but this man's gun went tip tip in a manner too terrible to listen to. That was how I got my name, Tip Tip, or Tibu Tip. It says, today Tibu Tip cannot be regarded as a hero since his exploits and gains were at the expense of other human beings. He must, however, be regarded as brave, daring, adventurer, good administrator, and a great leader. Tibu Tip spoke perfect Arabic and Kiswahili. He also spoke some of the tribal languages, but very little English. Very little English. Now, again, that gives you some idea about one of the most notorious Arab slave traders in the game. And if you want to go deeper into that subject, you can purchase that particular book if it's still available, or you can buy books dealing with the East African slave trade, dealing with the east coast of Africa, as far as from Somalia all the way down to Zanzibar and those areas. And they'll tell you about places that are like this. This is down the east coast, Lamu. That's a place in East Africa, one of the major slave ports. Very good. This, the Arabs and a short history, Heinz Halm, also deals with East Africa. The Bamana Empire by the Niger, Kingdom, Jihad, and Colonization, 1712 to 1912. And this also deals with East African, the Arab slave trade. In those particular periods, we have to take into consideration that when Islam came in, they contributed as well as they devastatedly destroyed stuff, And one of the thing that they destroyed most in East Africa as well as in West Africa was culture. They destroyed it. And the other thing was they tried to literally erase certain aspects of language and tradition because they felt that it was a threat to Islam. And that it would literally, eventually, if you had a problem, you would resort back to your old stuff and, you be out the box. So those are some in those particular areas. Other books on Arab Islam. So let's deal with that. You have Slavery on the Front of Islam. Slavery on the Front of Islam. It's by Paul E. Lovejoy. And this book was originally done by Marcus Weiner Publishers, which is a major publisher for West African and Islamic material. One of the premier scholars is a guy by the name of John Hunwick. John Hunwick. He's well known in the area of East African Islam and East African slavery. As you can see, the name of the book is Slavery on the Frontiers of Islam, Paul E. Lovejoy. This was originally written in 2004, and again, Marcus Weiner Publishing issues. And just to give you a little outline, the collection of essays offers a new paradigm in which the trans-Sahara and transatlantic worlds of slavery are brought into focus under the name lens. While slave societies have considered either transatlantic slavery or slavery in the world of Islam, rarely has any study combined an enslavement of Africans in America and the lands of Islam in one volume. Both of the Sahara and the Atlantic world drew up the Western and Central Sudan for the enslaved population that was imported. But in general, the two markets for slaves have been treated in isolation and without reference to the common bond of Islam and the multiple roles that Islam has played in the history of slavery. Whether in West Africa itself, the Americas, or in the Islamic Mediterranean, Western Africans served as the point of dispersion across desert and sea. But it also the final destination of many of those who were enslaved but who were not transported across the Atlantic or the Sahara. Enslaved Muslims and non-Muslims who were brought into the world of Islam reinforced or invented cultural features that were central to the identities as people from the Central Sudan. The relationships between Islam and slavery explored a series of frontiers. So again, this shows you that intricate merging, that intricate synthesizing between Islam and West African culture and how certain indigenous African resisted. You know, they was resilient about keeping them jokers away. So if you go into certain areas like Soninke or the early Ghanaians, they wasn't swayed by Islam. And they was like, you know, it ain't all that. We don't want that. We going with our own stuff. And a lot of traditional Africans did some of the same. Here's another good one. This is Slavery in the Arab World Today. Slavery in the Arab World Today. That's by Maury Gordon. Maury Gordon. And as you can see, it was done by the Amsterdam of New York. And those that don't know, Amsterdam was New York's real name. Right? And it says that this was originally published in 1987. And some of the areas in which it covers: slavery concealed in the midst of time, the attitude of Islam towards slavery, occupation and status of slaves in the Islamic world, sex and slavery in the Arab world. Think about that. See, when we thought about slavery in the Arab world, I know a lot of us in the West ain't thinking nothing about no sex. They said that most of the slavers that acquired slaves were because of sexual purposes. Versus it was just the opposite in
For the Europeans.
yeah, well, not for the Europeans, but for the West. The reason I say not for the Europeans, because some of the Europeans were the recipients of Arab slaves. Remember, they went to Eastern Europe and all of that. Remember, Bosnia and all of them, a lot of them was Muslim countries now. They've been Muslim countries for a long time. You know, Kurds and all of them type of folks, yeah, Muslims. It says early Muslim traffic and slaves on the frontiers, Araby, 1500 to 1800, heyday of slave trade, 1800 to 1900, slavery in all forms and slavery in all of its forms. So it goes into that. Again, it's a very well written book, and it gives you details about what both gentlemen were talking about on video footage. Detailed material. Again, that's by Maury Gordon, Slavery in the Arab World Today. Now, another piece also dealing with Arab slavery, and that's by Humphrey Fisher. As you can see, it says Slavery in the History of Muslim Black Africa. Slavery in the History of Muslim Black Africa. This was originally written by Hearst and Company, and it was originally published in London. And it was originally done in 1988. But this publication came out in 2001. It was a republish. Give you a little idea. The institution of slavery was central to the trade and society developed within the African Muslim world for centuries. Its certain location, it is still, excuse me 1 second. Let me call you back, I'm involved in something. Okay. Excuse me. Let me start over. The institution of slavery was central to the trade and societal development within the African Muslim world for centuries. In certain locations, it is still, in fact, in practice. What are in origins of slavery in Muslim Africa, and how widespread is it? How does slavery as practiced in the region differ from Western chattel slavery? These are other issues are explored in Fisher's investigation into how Africans enslavement by Berbers, Arabs, and other Africans became institutionalized and legitimized throughout Muslim Africa. Attending to the religious, social, and economic context of the rise and establishment of slavery within this region, the author illuminates the complex dynamics shaping slavery from the 10th to the 19th century. The 10th to the 19th, how many years is that?
900.
900. See how long they shit is? 900. That's just deep. It says, he explains that while free Muslims could not legally be enslaved, these laws were rarely enforced. He read as cases in which slaves developed strong ties of loyalty and affection for their owners, as well as others in which slaves were determined to break free from bondage or perish in the attempt. Fisher's account explains how slaves came to serve as currency. Let me say that again. Fisher's account explains how slaves came to serve as currency, goods, eunuchs, soldiers, and in some cases as statesmen. This is a cornucopia of a variety of what Islam did to the slave as an individual, as well as he did it economically and socially and politically and religiously and so forth and so on, which was different than how the Western Europeans looked at slavery. One of the things was they were trying to separate you from them, where that the Arabs had no problem joining in if you was going to add something to the pot. If you was going to add something significant to the pot, we don't care whether you black, purple, or whatever, we're going to be down with it. So that's Humphrey Fisher, Slavery in the History of Muslim Black Africa. And two other books on that same subject, and that is, three, and that is, I told you about John Hunwick. This is West African Islam and the Arab world. He's one of the foremost authorities in that area. Again, a white boy, does, a great deal of research in that area, but I've been reading him for at least about over 20 something years, various, material back and forth. And he's always referenced in other books. So if you read material to say, oh, John Hunwick wrote so-and-so, or he got 5 papers written on this, and that's what you look for. It said West Africa is defined as an area south of the Sahara between the Atlantic and Lake Chad, encompassing the Sahel zone, tropical forests, and pastoral lands. West Africans speak languages belonging to 3 major families: Niger-Congo, Nilo-Saharan, and Afro-Asiatic, as well as the official languages French and English. Let me say that again.
Official.
Yeah, you heard that, didn't you?
Yeah, I got it.
And it says, introduced in the 19th century and the 20th century. The languages of scholarship and learning has been Arabic since the 7th century, when Arab merchants, soldiers, and missionaries came south and established major trading routes. Timbuktu became a center of commerce and learning, and kingdoms such as ancient Ghana emerged as major regional powers. This study, which provides an overview of the regional history from medieval times to the 20th century, traces the development following colonialism, the effects of the Arab nationalism on West African politics, the role of the Israelis in helping to develop new states, the politics of OPEC, and the rise of Islamic extremism. So he goes all the way to ancient to contemporary, to what's going on now, and shows you, the connecting of the dots. So that's John Hunwick, and that's West African Islam and the Arab world. The 2 books that I used in the early days on this were by Spencer Tremingham. And Spencer is also known as one of the earlier writers on West African Islam in, I would say, the 7th and the 8th century, which is the first turnover of Islam coming into Africa and the establishment of West Africa into a lot of these religious systems. So in this one, it's called The Influence of Islam Upon Africa, and this is called The History of Islam in West Africa, both by the same individual, Spencer Tremingham. And there are very few books written about West African history or written about Islam, and these books are not mentioned. It's like impossible. So you're going to get Tremingham, and if you read very in-depth material like this, it's the history of Islam in Africa. And as you can see, it's written by Nehemiah Levitt Zion and Randall L. Pools. Randall L. Pools. Livington write a few different material, but this is probably the most extensive book that I ever purchased on West African Islam and West African history. I mean, far as the amount of detailed material. But the most important book that I have on West African Islam, much West African history, is this book here. I just got it 2 weeks ago, and it's probably one of the greatest books available. It's called the Tariq el-Fatash, or the subtitle is called the Timbuktu Chronicles. This book was written in 1493, and it literally was written by a gentleman by the name of El-Haji Mahmud Kati. El-Haji Mahmud Kati. And this is a very important document. There's two of them. One called the Tariq el-Fatash, and the other one is called the Tariq el-Sudan, or the Tariq as-Sudan. And these documents are first-hand eyewitness accounts of what went on in Mali and Ghana and Songhai. Eyewitness. I was there. I wrote about it. This ain't no second-hand. Most of this is second and third hand. This is first hand.
That 2 weeks ago?
2 weeks ago, right?
I'll get the information from you later.
Well, you can get it right down at Dexter's.
Okay.
Now, how did Dexter acquire this? Let me give you a little background. When I went down to the store and I was looking for some other material and seeing that he had it, I was like, where you get this? He said, oh, I got it from you. I said, what you mean you got it from me? He said, remember last time you was here? I said, yeah. He said, remember when we was talking about Teofilo Obenga and Black Africa? I said, yeah. I said, yeah, I told you where to get the freaking book from instead of buying it from the wholesaler. He said, yeah. He said, well, I went to the publisher, and that's where I got the book. I said, you kidding me? So I looked at the bottom, and it's African World Press. The guy who's the publisher is Casa Holmes. He's a good friend of mine, known him about 40, 45 years. And he's been in the publishing business. And one of the things is, Casa Holmes originally is from Ethiopia. But he publishes, he's been publishing books. The two oldest black publishing houses in America is Third World Press and African World Press. That's this book, this publisher right here. He was originally called Red Sea Press. And you know why he called it Red Sea Press. I said he's from where?
Oh, where?
Ethiopia.
Ethiopia, yes.
So, anyway,